Hi, I'm Rich Harrington, and welcome to this edition of Photoshop CS4 Sneak Peek. Today, we're going to take a look at tools like dodging and burning, as well as Smudge, the blur tool, and see some of the improvements that have happened in CS4. Let's jump in. Here we have an image that has a lot of saturation in it, and I'm going to take advantage of the Smudge tool. Now, the Smudge tool is usually used to either desaturate or saturate an image. The important option here is vibrance. Now, let's leave vibrance unchecked and start to brush on the bird here. Notice as we're brushing over the bird how we're losing quite a bit of saturation. And in fact, the image loses almost all of its color instantly. I'll simply choose Undo, and this time we'll check Vibrance. Now as we're going through, it is lowering the saturation in the image, but doing it in a much gentler way. Instead of adjusting saturation, it's really adjusting the vibrance, which preserves more of the subtle details in the color areas. And this is nice. Instead of making brutal adjustments to the image, you can make gentle adjustments. By switching the Smudge tool to use vibrance, it's a very useful way to tone down or pump up color. Remember, you can always change that from desaturate to saturate and use that to pop certain areas using the more isolated vibrance adjustment. Just be sure to play with your brush size as well as the hardness setting to get a nice gentle fall off. Let's go ahead and switch to another image here. And here we're going to use our dodging and burning. The dodge and burn commands are located here with the Smudge tool, and you can use these two together. When we dodge an image here, you'll see that it gets lighter. One of the things that tends to happen though as we dodge is that the image loses quite a bit of saturation. Let's undo. If we check the Protect Tones option here, you'll notice that we avoid clipping in the highlights and shadows, and the colors really won't shift in hue. So as we lighten this area here, notice that the red and the blue is preserved even though that's getting a bit lighter. And this lets us go ahead and open up an area and brighten it with a selective tool like a paintbrush. This works great if you have a tablet connected to your computer as well, because you can use airbrush sensitivity and push harder with the stylus to really control the amount of the adjustment. Now, besides this working here, we can also take it and put it on the burn tool, making sure, of course, that the Protect Tones option is also still checked. And this lets us go ahead and darken areas, so we could take these metal highlights here and push them down a bit. And by leaving that Protect Tone option checked, we get a more natural preservation of our highlights and shadows, and it goes after the midtones and still preserves the color area. We could do that up here on this patch here to push it down a little bit, and notice that no shifting is happening in the color of the image. So that works great. An important adjustment there to the Smudge tool as well as the dodge and the burn tool. Fortunately, we also have useful adjustments up in our tools like blur and smudge. Let's see how it works. I'm going to switch here to a new layer, and let's zoom in. And what I want to do is go after some of the flyaway hair here. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the Smudge tool and change this to push the darker pixels. Now, by switching the mode to darken, it's going to only push the darker pixels. And we'll take the strength option down just a little bit. Now, the key here is to make a new layer. And as you start to do this, tell it to sample all layers. This way, as you smudge, it's going to push those pixels and allow you to get in there and clean up the edge. There we go. And see how we can actually push those darker pixels in to get the flyaway hair. But what's quite cool is this is on its own layer, so I could turn it off and on. That way you could see the before and after results, or go back and adjust the opacity, the feathering of this layer, blend it together a little bit to make it more subtle. The cool thing here is that you can actually sample all layers, so by making a blank, empty layer above your image, you can use these tools. Let's go ahead and try that with the blur tool here. And I want to go ahead and soften her lips just a little bit. Make sure Sample All Layers is checked. Get a smaller brush by pressing the left bracket key, and we can go over her lips there and just smooth them out a bit. Notice if I turn off the background layer, that you actually see the blurring was isolated to its own layer there. And that makes it useful. We can also take advantage of things like eraser here and go back and remove a little bit of the adjustments we've made. Let's just give that a nice soft edge there, and we'll trace along this hairline here. There we go. And by doing it that way, we're able to greater control how it all comes together. So, important changes into these hand tools here, which will let you get the job done. Remember, the key is to go ahead and look up in the options bar. So, when you have the blur tool, the sharpen tool, or the smudge tool selected, make sure the sample all layers box is checked. Then do your smudging, blurring, or sharpening on its own empty layer to constrain the adjustments. Similarly, when using tools like dodge, burn, or sponge, make sure you take advantage of the options bar. For dodge and burn, we have the option to protect tones, and for smudge, you have the vibrance options. All of these are going to make these tools more useful to you under Photoshop CS4. So, that's it for this episode. I hope you learned some of the new things that you could do with Photoshop CS4. It's a very cool release with lots of great new features that really make it easier to get the job done. Go ahead and visit cs4.com. We could find out additional information, enter our contest, and find all of the episodes in one place. And if you enjoy our training, be sure to check out our regular series. We offer 2 free weekly podcasts all about Photoshop. The first is called Understanding Adobe Photoshop. It's designed for people who work in digital photography, graphic design, or just generalists who want to get more out of what Photoshop offers. For those of you who work in video and motion graphics, we offer another show called Photoshop for Video. And this show is all about using Photoshop to create content for professional video production. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Rich Harrington.